Scaphism. Scaphism was a method of execution reportedly used in ancient Persia, known for being one of the most prolonged and horrifying ways to die. The process involved two hollowed-out wooden boats or troughs. The condemned person was laid inside one and the second was placed on top, effectively sandwiching the body, with only the head, arms, and legs sticking out. Once trapped, the victim wasn't left to starve. Instead, they were force-fed a mixture of milk and honey. This wasn't done once but repeated daily. The heavy intake led to severe diarrhea, which filled the space inside the wooden shell, coating the victim in their own waste. Meanwhile, their exposed skin, the parts not enclosed in the boat, was coated with more honey to attract insects. The entire setup was left either floating in stagnant water or placed under the open sun. Flies, ants, wasps, and beetles would gather, drawn by the honey and filth. Over time, the insects didn't just bite, they began burrowing the body. Some accounts describe bugs laying eggs, maggots hatching, and feeding directly on the living tissue. There are even mentions of worms entering the eyes or mouth. Death didn't come quickly. The combination of exposure, dehydration, infection, and tissue decay stretched the process over several days, possibly even weeks. The punishment was reportedly reserved for traitors or those who had deeply offended the state. Most of what's known about Scaphism comes from Greek historians, describing it as an extreme example of Persian cruelty. The Pear of Anguish. The Pear of Anguish was a metal device shaped like a bulb or a closed flower, but it wasn't meant to stay closed. It was designed to be inserted into a person's mouth, vagina, or rectum. Once in place, a screw on the top would be turned, slowly opening the petals outward. The more it opened, the more internal tearing or damage it caused. There were different versions of the pear. One was said to be used for people accused of blasphemy, inserted into the mouth. Another version was used on women accused of sex-related crimes, inserted vaginally. And for those charged with homosexuality or similar offenses, it was reportedly used rectally. None of this was designed for killing. It was meant for punishment, interrogation, or public humiliation. The metal wasn't sharp. It didn't cut. Instead, it expanded slowly, causing pressure, tearing the internal organs depending on how far it was opened. In some cases, the damage might have been permanent. In others, it may have just been used as a threat to terrify prisoners into confessing. Lingchi, the death by 1,000 cuts, was a form of execution used in imperial China for crimes considered especially serious, things like treason, patricide, or killing one's master. The punishment was meant to go beyond simply ending someone's life. The execution wasn't just to kill the person. It was to make the death slow, painful, and very visible to others. The method involved tying the condemned to a wooden frame, usually in a market or other public space. Then, using a sharp knife, the executioner would begin slicing away small parts of the body, sometimes starting with the chest, arms, or thighs. These cuts were meant to be shallow at first. Some accounts mention as many as 100 or more cuts before the final blow was delivered, usually a stab to the heart or decapitation to end it. The actual number of cuts varied, and there's no confirmed rule for how many were made. Some executions may have involved fewer than 50 cuts, others far more, depending on the sentence and the skill or cruelty of the executioner. Sometimes the victim was given opium before the execution, maybe to reduce the pain a little, or maybe to keep them awake and alive longer during the punishment. Lingchi wasn't just about hurting the body, it also had a deeper meaning. In traditional Chinese beliefs, it was important to keep your body whole for the afterlife. So when someone was slowly cut into pieces, it didn't just cause physical pain, it also meant their soul might suffer after death. Impalement. Impalement was exactly what it sounds like: execution by inserting a sharpened stake through the human body. The method appeared in various cultures across history, but it became especially infamous in Eastern Europe, particularly under Vlad the Impaler in 15th century Wallachia. The process began with the preparation of the stake. It was usually made of wood, long enough to hold a human body upright and sharpened to a point, but it wasn't always razor sharp. In many cases, the tip was deliberately dulled to slow the process and maximize suffering. The victim was either laid down or hoisted into position, and the stake was inserted through the rectum, vagina, or sometimes directly through the abdomen or chest, depending on the technique. Once impaled, the body was gradually slid down by its own weight. The stake would pass through muscles and organs, often avoiding immediate fatal damage. If placed carefully, it could take hours, sometimes even a day or more, for the victim to die. In some cases, the stake would exit through the mouth, shoulder, or neck. The bodies were then left on display. Rows of impaled corpses served as warnings to approaching armies, rebellious locals, or anyone thinking of challenging authority. Vlad III reportedly impaled thousands of people, both enemies and his own subjects, and arranged their bodies in patterns across open fields. The Ottomans, Persians, and even some European powers also used impalement at different times. It was public, slow, and deliberately horrifying. Flaying Alive. Flaying alive was the practice of removing a person's skin while they were still conscious, not as a form of execution alone, but as an extended punishment meant to inflict maximum pain, humiliation, and fear. It was used in several ancient cultures, including the Assyrians, Persians, and even in medieval Europe and parts of Asia, often as a response to rebellion, betrayal, or blasphemy. The process usually began with stripping the victim naked and binding them in place, arms tied above the head or stretched out to keep them from moving. The executioner would then use a sharp knife to make incisions, usually starting at the legs, back, or face. From there, the skin was slowly peeled away in strips, layer by layer. The key was to avoid major blood vessels at first to keep the person alive as long as possible. Assyrian records show stone carvings of this punishment being used on prisoners, usually rebels or defeated kings. After peeling the skin off the person's body, they didn't just throw it away. Sometimes they nailed the skin to city walls to scare others. In some cases, they even filled the skin with straw and hung it up like a horrible warning sign. Death came from blood loss, shock, or infection, but not immediately. In skilled or especially cruel hands, a victim might remain alive for hours. Breaking wheel, also called the Catherine wheel, was a way of execution used in medieval Europe. The person was tied to a big wooden wheel, either lying flat on the ground or standing up. Then, one by one, their arms and legs were smashed with a heavy metal bar or club. The goal wasn't to kill the person right away. The executioner would start by breaking the arms and legs, usually in a certain order, to make sure the victim stayed alive as long as possible. After the bones were smashed, the broken limbs were twisted and woven through the gaps in the wheel's spokes. The body looked twisted and crushed, barely human. Then, in many cases, the whole wheel was lifted up and placed on a tall pole for everyone to see. The person wasn't always dead yet, they were left there, bleeding and broken, to slowly die from pain, heat, thirst, or just the shock of it all. Punishment by the wheel was typically reserved for the worst crimes, things like murder, robbery combined with violence, or treason. In Germany and France, especially during the 16th and 17th centuries, the sentence sometimes included a mercy blow to the chest or neck to speed up death, but only if the court allowed it. Mercy blow was a final shot to the chest or neck to kill the person quickly and spare them from suffering of dying slowly. Public display was part of the punishment. The body could stay on the wheel for days, picked at by birds or left to rot. The spectacle was meant to make an example, a slow, brutal message that certain crimes wouldn't be tolerated. Sawing in half. The victim was usually hung upside down by the ankles, and that was done on purpose. Hanging them this way made sure that blood kept flowing to the brain, which meant they stayed awake and aware for longer. Then, once they were suspended, two executioners would begin the sawing. They didn't start at the head or the chest, they started at the groin, right between the legs. From there, they slowly sawed downward, cutting through the pelvis, the spine, and deeper. Because of the upside-down position, the person didn't pass out quickly. They felt every part of it for as long as their body could take it. A regular wood-cutting saw was used, and the process was intentionally slow. The saw would move back and forth through muscle, bone, and organs, with each movement causing intense pain. Depending on how long they remained conscious, the victim might be alive as the saw reached the abdomen or even the chest. Sometimes the execution stopped halfway, just enough to kill or permanently disable the victim. Other times, the body was completely split in two and left on public display as a warning. The brazen bull. The bull itself was a life-sized hollow sculpture, made entirely of bronze, designed to look like a real animal. A door was built into its side, just large enough to fit a person. Once the condemned was locked inside, a fire was lit beneath the bull, heating the metal until the person inside was literally roasted alive. According to a legend, the man who invented the brazen bull, a guy named Perillos, showed it off to Phalaris, the ruler, thinking he'd be impressed. But instead, Phalaris threw Perillos into the bull to test it out on him. Crucifixion. Before being crucified, the person was usually stripped naked and beaten, sometimes with whips that had bits of bone or metal tied into them to tear the skin. Then they were forced to carry a heavy wooden beam on their shoulders called the patibulum to the execution site, which was often outside the city. At the site, that beam was lifted and attached to a vertical post already set into the ground. In many cases, the person wasn't nailed. They were tied to the cross with ropes, which made the suffering last even longer. But when nails were used, usually through the wrists and ankles, it caused incredible pain and made the body go into shock faster. Once hanging on the cross, breathing became a struggle. The body's position made it almost impossible to breathe normally. The only way to get a breath was to push up with the legs, which were often broken or nailed in place. Every breath came with more pain. Death wasn't quick. Some people hung there for hours, others for days. They eventually died from exhaustion, suffocation, and dehydration, or just being exposed to the elements. A Roman writer, Seneca, wrote that some victims stayed alive for days. Sometimes the executioners would break their legs to make death come faster. This was called crurifragium, because without leg support, the person couldn't push up to breathe anymore. Crucifixion was mostly used for slaves, rebels, and anyone considered an enemy of the Roman state. Roman citizens were usually spared from it unless their crime was extremely serious. While it's most famously remembered because of the crucifixion of Jesus, the Romans crucified thousands, especially during uprisings and civil unrest. Elephant execution. It involved trained elephants used to kill prisoners in a controlled and often prolonged manner. These elephants were not wild or unpredictable. They were specifically taught how to execute a person with precision. The victim would be brought to a public place, usually a royal court, palace courtyard, or open square, and forced to the ground. The elephant would then carry out the execution under the direction of a handler or royal official. In some cases, the elephant was trained to crush the limbs first, one by one, before delivering the final blow to the head or chest. This method extended the victim's suffering and demonstrated the total control the executioner had over the process. Other variations included the elephant using its tusks to stab the person, stepping on the torso to rupture internal organs, or tossing the body into the air and trampling it repeatedly. Some elephants were trained to delay the final kill, waiting for a signal before proceeding, so the punishment could be drawn out. The execution served not only as a method of death, but also as public spectacle and political warning.